Good morning and welcome to the third invited speaker, another exciting talk by Professor Serre from Brown University. He's a professor of cognitive and psychological sciences as well as computer science, and he received his PhD in neuroscience from MIT, from Poggius Group in 2006, and his MSc in electrical engineering and computer science from Telecom Bretagne in France in 2000. And his research focuses on understanding the neural computations, that support visual perception, and has been featured in various media outlets, including the BBC, The Economist and New Scientist, Scientific American, Technology Review, and Slashdot. Dr. Serre serves as the facility director of the Center for Computation and Visualization, and is the associate director of the Center for Computational Brain Science at Brown. He's also an affiliate of the Carney Institute for Brain Science and the Data Science Institute at Brown University. Additionally, he holds an international chair in AI Toulouse Institute in France, and he has actively participated as an area chair and senior program committee member of prestigious machine learning conferences, including ours, AAAI, ICML, ICLR, and EURIPS. Dr. Serre is a neuroscience section editor for the journal PLOS, Computational Biology, and he has received several awards, including the NSF Early Career Award, DARPA's Young Faculty Award, and the Director's Award. Along with his team, he was awarded the 2021 PAMI Helmholtz Prize and the 2022 PAMI Mark Everingham Prize for their work on human action recognition. So today he's going to give us an exciting talk about human vision and human neurons versus artificial neurons that this conference is mostly all about. So, Professor Serre.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. Thank you. Well, delighted to be here. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Before I get started, let me start with a punchline. I'm going to try to make the case that modern vision is winning on benchmarks, but that comes at the expense of models that are becoming increasingly less aligned with human vision. And if, like myself, you care about building a less artificial or a more natural artificial intelligence, I think there are at least two possible fixes we should be considering, and I'll try to give you aspects of representative projects along those lines that we are working on in my group. The first one will be about trying to rethink the way we train our computational models to be closer to the way we learn to see in the first place by adapting data diets and learning objectives that more closely mimic the way babies learn. I will then proceed to try to make a case that the dominant architectures in computer vision and AI, which are feed-forward neural networks, should be expanded. Our brains are massively feedback machines. Over the past several decades, neuroscience has done a great deal of progress in shaping our understanding of what these feedback mechanisms does for vision. And I'm going to show you some initial work in my group trying to leverage some of that knowledge to build more robust, generalizable vision systems. Okay. Before I get into the weeds, I want to start with a little demo. And I want a demo that's going to serve to illustrate what we mean when we think about feed-forward vision in human neuroscience. So the demo is going to be a rapid categorization experimental paradigm. You're going to be flashed with images, very briefly, about 60 or so milliseconds here. And you're going to have to guess whether an object, in particular an animal here in those examples, whether animal will be presented, seen or not. So in the lab, you would have to press a button. We would also require you to respond as quickly as you can, well under 500 milliseconds. Here, I'll ask you to think in your head. So, oops, sorry. Demo was working just a second ago. So here you go. This was fast. This was non-animal. Animal. Animal. All right. So I think you get the gist of it. Pun intended. I think at that presentation speed, people are typically not able to perceive every detail in the scene, but they're able to get what we call the gist of the scene. At the very least, people are able to report the presence or absence of a dominant class of objects. The assumption in our field is that this kind of very rapid, pre-attentive type of processing is based on a single feedforward sweep through a part of the visual system known as the ventral stream of the visual cortex. Back when I studied my PhD, some 25 years ago, there was a sense in the field that if we were able to develop a computational model that would be somewhat grounded in our understanding of the anatomy and physiology of the visual system, and that would be able to reproduce the kinds of human behavioral decisions that we've been measuring in the lab for the past several decades, then we would have achieved a major milestone for visual neuroscience. And so I studied my PhD several decades ago in the lab of Tommy Poggio at MIT, as Dimitris was saying. And back when I started, there was a fairly large effort in Tommy's group trying to develop neurobiologically grounded computational models of vision. Back then, you might have heard about the name HMAX. This was the kind of the dominant class of models that people were trying to develop. My goal was to try to ground this model in as much biology as I could, and so I spent the first several years of my PhD thesis trying to gather all the available experimental data from monkey electrophysiology studies that were available, and believe me, there is quite a few data that have been collected over the past several decades, with the goal to find and summarize all the tuning properties that I could find regarding the tuning of neurons, or the selectivity of neurons, along the ventral stream of the visual cortex. So this led to a computational model, which contained about half a dozen processing stages, where the parameters of guiding the selectivity of neurons along each one of those stages was grounded in neurobiology. So anything that I could find constraining the number of connections from one layer to the next, the size of the receptive fields, or the part, how big of a part of the image neurons look into, their frequency tuning, their orientation tuning, everything that I could find was baked into building an architecture that would summarize and integrate as best as we could what was known at the time about the anatomy and physiology of the visual system. So this led this computational model, showed it here on the slide, about half a dozen processing stages, hierarchically organized, roughly summarizing the gradual buildup in selectivity and invariance properties of neurons along our visual system. Back then, we didn't have the computational power that we have today, nor the data sets that we have. And so we were training those even relatively shallow deep neural networks, 6 layers, 8 layers, was still a challenge. We didn't have the means to do end-to-end training. And so the best game in town was really to leverage a learning approach where training would be greedy, layer-wise, from bottom layers up one layer at a time. And so although this was relatively simple by modern day standards, the approach was successful in the sense that we were able to train this biologically motivated computational model. And then when we evaluated on this binary animal non-animal classification task, we were able to achieve and match the level of performance of human observers across all our experimental conditions. So this was somewhat of a little bit of a success story in neuroscience. We then turned to computer vision, and one of my first PhD papers was at this very conference back in 2005, where we tried to evaluate the performance of this model, again, trained from natural scenes, and then testing its ability to generalize on what was available at the time, which was the Caltech 101. I don't think there was much to boast about in terms of accuracy. I think these types of architectures was reaching roughly around 40 to or mid-40 classification accuracy. But I think the good news and what was exciting at the time is that we were able to somewhat match what was considered to be state-of-the-art at the time, which were the kind of structured probabilistic models developed by Pietro Perona's group as well as others. We're not the only one trying to figure out how to train and kind of orchestrate those hierarchical models. Very smart and influential people, Jan Lequin and his students at the time, were also focusing on trying to figure out the best combination of very simple, elementary, biologically plausible operations, things like linear filtering, rectification, gain control, pooling, how to orchestrate those operations, and how to combine and leverage the best unsupervised learning rule to yield kind of proper learning in those architectures. This was, of course, before what I would deem the first deep learning revolution. I'm not going to dwell much on AlexNet, since I'm quite sure the entire audience is very familiar with this work. But the short version of the story is that the introduction of large-scale image data sets combined with the readily availability of GPUs, which provided sufficient computational power, enabled the training kind of now end-to-end of what were at the time, when you squint your eyes, AlexNet is pretty similar in terms of depth, number of units, and overall operations. This allowed these types of models to be trained kind of at scale and be successful on ImageNet. So we all know that this had a huge impact on our field, computer vision as well as AI. Perhaps the audience might be less familiar with the fact that the revolution in computer vision led to a tsunami, I would say, in human perception. One of the earlier work on that, in that direction was the work of Jim DiCarlo's group, who for the first time, I think in neuroscience, was able to leverage GPUs, starting from very similar hierarchical models of the sort we were working with, figure out a way to generate, and to leverage GPUs to get rid of the biological constraints that we had used in order to build these models, and instead optimize every hyperparameters in those architectures so that they would perform as best as possible for image categorization. And what they showed is that those models that were that have had no constraint from biology were able to fit neuroscience data, neural electrophysiology data, better than any other existing models. So what I'm showing here on this plot, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time because you're going to see several similar plots. Every dot is going to be a model. On the x-axis is going to be the accuracy of each one of those models on an image categorization task. On the y-axis is going to be a metric regarding the degree to which the learned representations by these models agree with the types of tuning and activations found in our visual cortex. The focus here in this talk will be on a specific area known as the inferotemporal or IT cortex, because it's an area that is assumed to play a critical role in our ability to recognize objects and process visual information. The main finding from this, the work from this group, was that if you look at the red dots here, those are models that were optimized for image categorization. And so their main finding was that as you crank the knob towards better image classification, those models not only were starting to do much better than any previous hierarchical architectures, but they were also better at fitting or explaining monkey electrophysiology data. This was a little bit of a letdown for myself, because if you look at the H-max, which is, I don't know if you can see here, but this is one of the black dots in the middle of the blue cloud. The H-max turns out to be a pretty mediocre model in that cloud. It's about half of the performance of these optimized models, and it's about half of the explainable variance in terms of neural alignments. And so the optimistic view from that result was that if you want to design better models of human vision, then you can essentially let go of the biological details and instead focus on engineering and squeezing out all the performance that you can out of these hierarchical models. And in fact, these models were kind of pre-ImageNet and AlexNet and the follower, but they did a follow-up study a few years later, and as you can see here, so the green dots correspond, it contains AlexNet, MobileNet, and other kind of representative computer vision models. As you can see, the trend continues there. Right? So as these models become more and more performant at image categorization, they somehow align better with human data. The This was still, the last thing this types of study was conducted was, some 8 years ago or so. This was still what I would call the first wave of AI, right? We didn't have yet internet scale kind of data sets. This was pre-transformers. And so a couple of years ago, we wanted to ask how well models, vision models from our community, how well do these track with progress in neuroscience? And so for this analysis and a lot of the work that I'm going to be presenting, we turned to a PyTorch library called TIM, which contains, and I'm sure most people here are familiar with this library, it contains several hundreds of a lot of representative models that have been pre-trained. They are in PyTorch, they are pre-trained, so you can have access to all your favorite CNN, transformers, all kinds of pre-training, so on and so forth. So we took a representative subset of about 350 of those, and we wanted to evaluate those for their ability to account for primate vision, and in particular starting with evaluating their accuracy on ImageNet. So for the evaluation that I'm going to show you, we used a particular set of annotations for ImageNet, which were conducted at Berkeley by Shankar and colleagues. This is a very good data set and set of annotations. I'm not going to do justice by only mentioning their name, but I'll just say that these are multi-label, which fixes some of the issue with ImageNet. And most importantly, it comes with a tediously collected human benchmark. One point about this benchmark is that at this point, we are far from the initial motivation of some of the work that I gave you at the very beginning with the rapid presentation, where our visual system is constrained to operate as fast as it possibly can. This benchmark reflects human accuracy in unspeeded conditions. So people have all the time they need to classify those images. And so if we look at the accuracy of this set of team models, we found that an astonishing 1/3, 30%, were within the confidence interval of human classification accuracy. Surprisingly, about 1% even outperform humans. So I would say from the perspective of image classification, and from the perspective of a human vision scientist, the problem is solved. These models are effectively performing at the level or better than human observers. All right, so I'm going to show you two metrics on those models, and I'm going to start with a metric of neural alignment, very similar to the work that I showed you earlier. Here we're using different data sets. These are data collected by collaborators of ours at Harvard. And I'm, again, not going to do justice. There's a lot of good things that I should be telling you about this data set, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you that this is large and diverse enough so that we can have reliable estimates of alignment. All right, so here's our standard kind of plot. ImageNet accuracy on the x-axis, neural alignment on the y-axis. And I'm going to, so human accuracy is this gray kind of stripe here. And I'm gonna layer different models based on their architectures and their training. So here you see first the CNN and trained within various setups. Some are adversarially trained in yellow, which actually interestingly improve the alignment a little bit, as well as both kind of standard ImageNet pre-trained models and internet scale pre-trained models. Here are the convolutional VIT, ConvVIT. Here are the transformer models, VITs. And here are the linear fit to how well those models predict, or how well ImageNet classification accuracy predicts neural alignment. I hope you can appreciate the fact that, initially, especially with convolutional neural networks, as we were getting models that were more and more performant, there was a slight increase in the ability of these models to account for monkey electrophysiology. We are now with models that are so large scale and so powerful that this trend has largely reversed, with a negative correlation between the performance of this model for image categorization and their ability to account for neural data. I should also mention that this meta-analysis is just coming out in a neuroscience journal, but because we had to push the article in press almost a year ago, we had missed some of the latest and greatest models that I'm sure many people in the audience here might be asking about themselves about. And so I asked one of my graduate students, Akash, to quickly run, a few days ago, some of what he thought would be models of interest to this community. And so here you can see overlaid in purple are your favorite foundation models. There is Dino v3, there is JEPA, there is EVA, and I hope you can appreciate the fact that although we know that all those foundational models are fantastic models, they solve all kinds of tasks that we didn't think would be so easily solvable by today's benchmark, and yet they make very little difference in terms of how well they align with our own visual system. The second metric and the second measure of alignment that I want to tell you about is a metric of behavioral alignment. So you're going to have to bear with me a little bit in terms of how we get to this human behavioral alignment metric. So in order to collect behavioral data at scale, we developed an online game, which we call ClickMe. I should say that ClickMe is a little bit of a misnomer because people don't click, but they really paint. We had published the first version of this game, or the data from the game, back in 2019. We're now in the process of scaling up that game. So back in 2019, we were able to collect data for a subset of the validation set of ImageNet. We have now set our eyes on collecting data for the entire ImageNet. I don't know if the QR code is going to work, but if you just want to try the game and play it, you can just Google Brown ClickMe. All right, so what is this game? If you start playing the game, I'm going to call you the teacher, and you start from a computer screen with an image and a class label. You are told that you are playing with a student somewhere on a remote computer. The student starts from a blank screen, and the teacher, you, have to somewhat introspect and ask yourself what are the most informative part of this image that could tell the student or give in to the student communicate the class label of that image. Okay? So the student starts from a blank screen, and then pixels get gradually revealed, and then the role of the game is for the team, or in particular for the student, to recognize and really figuring out what are the best, most informative pixels about the class label. And so you can do this for many, many trials. You can average across many, many subjects. And so what happens when you do this is that you get the kinds of maps that are shown here on the far right. So you see the first column correspond to images from ImageNet. The next column correspond to the kinds of importance maps we are able to get from human observers. There's a lot I could say about this game. There's a lot of limitations associated with the collection of psychophysics data at this scale. All I'm going to say is that we've done a lot of follow-up kind of psychophysics validation, and we're pretty confident that the parts of those images that have been selected do indeed reflect visual features that are genuinely diagnostic for visual classification by human observers, and I'll leave it at that. In general, we find a lot of consistency across subjects. For animated objects, we find that people will typically select part of the face, facial components. On inanimated objects, they will tend to select often nameable components, things like wheels and headlights for cars, etc. So here we're not going to do a direct fit. The way we're going to match the alignment between models and humans, we're going to compute attribution maps from models, and then we're going to be correlating importance maps or attribution maps from models with those of human observers. If the strategies used by humans and the models align, then we have a high correlation score. If it does not, then we get a low correlation score. Before I show you quantitative results, I wanted to show you a few of those attribution maps. Again, these are all the columns on the left side. I should also point out that the study was published in 2022. These models are now a little bit outdated, but I think you get the gist. Just as a preview, before I show you quantitative results, just by glancing at those maps, I hope you can appreciate the fact that whatever strategy those models are using, it looks quite different from the strategy used by human observers. It tends to be much more diffuse, less localized, and less centered around kind of identifiable and nameable components. And so here are the results. For all of the models, the trend we find in this human behavioral alignment agrees fairly well with the prior neural alignment metric that I showed you. And again, all the latest and greatest foundational models are not really changing that trend. Right, I want to open a quick parenthesis here and draw your attention to this far left column with the harmonized VIT. So when a few years ago, we developed a method to force alignment between deep neural network and human observers. The idea is pretty simple. We are computing attribution methods based on the gradient. The gradient is differentiable, so you can effectively force the gradient of models. You can co-train a model for both image classification and for forcing the gradient to be in good alignment with the importance maps derived from humans. The good news is that this works. That means we know how to do optimization. And so you get those seemingly very human-like importance maps. The reason I'm showing you this is because I think this is something important about those models. The fact that we can force them to adopt a more human-like strategy suggests that there is nothing in principle preventing them from adopting this strategy. It's just they don't do it spontaneously when we train them on static internet images. And so the rest of my talk will be about trying to figure out more developmentally appropriate, ecologically valid ways to rethink the way we train our models so that these models would spontaneously discover visual strategies that align well with those used by human observers. So before I get into the details of the approach, I'm going to briefly mention that there is a lot of prior work in computational neuroscience that has been focusing on the learning of so-called stable visual representation from video data. The basic and very important feature of human vision is the function that we call object constancy, our ability to form stable visual representation that are invariant to changes in viewpoints, viewing distance, position in the visual field, etc. And the assumption is that in order to solve this object constancy problem, our visual system has to learn visual representations that are stable over all of these image transformations. And so there's been a lot of work decades ago on figuring out the right kind of incentive for neural networks to learn to latch on this kind of stable visual representations. Obviously, the way babies learn, the way our visual system developed, is quite different from the way we train our deep neural network. In order to illustrate this, I wanted to show you guys a little demo, which is a first-person view. So here we have a baby wearing a portable eye tracker. These are data that we collected a while ago in collaboration with a collaborator of mine, Dima Amso, who is a developmental psychologist. And what you see here is a baby. The cross corresponds to the eye fixation. What you see here is a baby that was given a bag of toys, and the baby is experiencing or discovering, learning about forming visual representation about those objects for the first time. And again, you see that the visual data diet is quite different from IID samples that our deep neural networks experience. Instead, because of head movements, because of object manipulation, the baby has experienced a whole host of transformation sequences where the objects are smoothly varying over poses. By Michael Frank and colleagues. We're not going to use these baby cams because I think they lack control, and I feel much more comfortable having good control over the range and the smoothness of object transformations that we're feeding our models with. So for this next set of experiments, we turn to a computer vision data set called Co3D. Some of you are probably familiar with the data set already. This is about 12,000 iPhone video data collected by crowdsource, falling into, I believe, 50 categories of objects. Part of the reason we focus on this Co3D is that it comes with NeRF and Gaussian splatting, which means that we have fairly good control on the transformation sequences. We can regenerate smooth transformation sequences and really control the range of variations that we are exposing our models with. We're going to be searching for a space of developmental objectives, and I am assuming that most people in the audience are very familiar with kind of the state-of-the-art in terms of self-supervised learning. I'm just going to briefly mention that we moved a little bit away here for this study from neuroscience, and instead we are leveraging a very standard kind of encoder-decoder architecture. In all of what I'm going to show you, we are doing reconstruction both in the pixel and latent space, which is one knob we can turn. And then very briefly, I hope we covered some of the most representative methods by attempting different approaches to feed those image sequences, transformation sequences to our neural networks. So anywhere from a single frame where you can do just a reconstruction with an autoencoder, you can mask part of the patches with a mask autoencoder, or you can extend these approaches to video MAE by considering a whole sequence where now you just mask a little 3D spatial-temporal tube to encourage the model to learn spatial-temporal dependencies. Or you can perform a pure temporal interpolation, where all the masks are thrown in an intermediate frame, and the rule of the game here is for the model to reconstruct what is hidden. So this is really an interpolation task. Or you can move all the masks at the end of the sequence and ask the model to extrapolate, to predict the final frame. And so the approach we're going to be taking for this is an autoregressive one. I'm going to show you results, but before I show you quantitative results, I want to emphasize this point that I made earlier. We're going to be starting from pre-trained models, and what I'm showing you here is a pre-trained BEIT, for which we just do a linear, so pre-train on internet image data sets, and then here we're just doing a linear probe for our Code3D. And what I'm showing here are the importance maps of that model for the target class of objects. And so I hope you can see that although the model is very accurate at classifying individual frames of that sequence, the strategy used or the kinds of visual features, the location of those features is completely unstable. It varies from, kind of almost independently from one frame to the next. So these neural networks are solving the problem of invariant object recognition, but using a strategy which potentially does not reflect that used by human observers. So similar plot to before, we have our team models, both CNN, VIT, with a linear probe on Code3D. We also collected some of those ClickMe data on Code3D, so this is our metric of alignment on the y-axis. So I'm not going to have time to show you results for all the models. I'm just going to focus on one of them, and you'll have to trust me that the results hold across multiple architectures. And the model that we picked here is a BIT large. Again, we've tried VITs of different sizes. Everything generalizes. So here, this is our starting point. This is a linear probe on a model that has been pre-trained. The top curve here is the human target. The confidence interval is the width of this gray line, which is pretty thin, which is why you're probably not seeing it. The first thing you can do is a fine-tuning of this model, right? And so we see that the fine-tuning works. The dot moves to the right, suggesting that the accuracy of the model on Code3D improves. But as you can see, the alignment with human is not. This suggests that the visual features that humans leverage during this classification task are not those that are optimal for image classification, but hopefully there are something else. Hopefully the something else is yet to be discovered. Here are our interpolation models, various versions. You see that in general, it doesn't hurt. So doing further tuning of the model on those interpolation, self-supervised loss does not really yield much improvement on Code3D, but it yields, in some cases, an improvement in terms of human alignment. And then the next final frame prediction, autoregressive models, do seem to yield a very significant improvement and a move in the directions of humans. We wanted to derive a measure of stability of the visual representations. And so this is where using Code3D and having 3D depth maps becomes useful. I'm going to go over the way we measure the stability of visual representation, and I should emphasize the fact that the same methods will apply to both importance maps derived from humans as well as importance maps derived from the models. So let's say that we're starting from an importance map on the left. We are just computing an attribution map for this particular canonical view. And then on the right is something similar, attribution map, but for an arbitrary view or arbitrary viewing distance. We can get one map from the canonical view, one map for the target view, and then our assumption is that if the visual representation is stable across changes in viewpoint, we should be able to take the importance map from the canonical view and then project it to the target view. And if the representation is stable, if the same features are useful at one view versus another, then there should be good correspondences. And when we measure the correlation between the ground truth and the reprojected map, we should find a high score. Conversely, if the representation varies across viewpoints, then this score should be relatively low. All right, so here are data for this BIT. We're getting very similar results for other models. On the y-axis is our human feature importance metric. On the x-axis is this stability score. And I hope you can see that in general, all the self-supervised models that are not doing a very good job at aligning with humans, essentially they fail to learn a stable representation. They fall in our lower left corner. Conversely, those better models, the ones that are much better aligning with humans, are the one that seems to be able to leverage a representation that is far more stable across viewpoints. I should point out that the final top gray point there is the benchmark for humans. All right. I realized that I went pretty quickly through a lot of things. I hope that some of the key take-home messages are clear nonetheless. I want to switch gear a little bit and tell you about a second point, which is that I think we need to rethink the way we engineer artificial vision system, which I would argue are, for the most part, feed-forward architectures, whether they are CNN or transformers. And because our brain is a massively feedback machine, we need to think ways and approaches to incorporate some of this feedback. So as a ground for motivation here, when we think about how we handle complexity and how to target increasingly more complex visual reasoning tasks, our field has largely turned to making models deeper and deeper. So in a way, the way we handle more and more complex visual reasoning tasks is by stacking more and more layers on top of another. Or, these days, this is mostly through scale by shoving more and more data and increasing the capacity of these networks. In comparison, this is not a strategy that is useful for our brains, right? After all, we cannot walk around with brains that are so big that we wouldn't be able to run or survive. So our visual system seems to have adopted a somewhat different strategy, where we have somewhere around maybe half a dozen processing stages. This is kind of fixed. But obviously, human observers are capable of dynamically adapt the amount of compute that they're going to dedicate to solving tasks of various complexity. And the way our brains do that is by leveraging feedback mechanisms, reentrant signals that allow the brains to essentially modulate ad nauseum the representation that were initially built through this rapid visual recognition processing. There's a lot of work that has been done in neuroscience suggesting or connecting those kinds of cortical feedback to mechanisms for scene organization and perceptual grouping. And so I think one of the key missing ingredients in our models through the addition of this feedback mechanism is really a way to endow them with better ways to structure the visual world we live in. As a side note, we already know from human subjects that image categorization can be solved in a single feed-forward sweep, essentially without cortical feedback. The fact that our field has focused so much on benchmarks like ImageNet, right, in a sense, is a potential explanation for why deeper and deeper networks lacking feedback can do so well on that task. But the bet I want to make with you today is that if we are starting to consider more challenging visual reasoning tasks, the necessity for this cortical feedback will become increasingly more obvious. So our starting point for this work was work we did many years ago, building fairly detailed computational neuroscience models of the recurrent neural circuitry found in your visual cortex. This is an example of a particular kind of circuitry called horizontal connections, which are connections that run within a processing stage in your visual system. Or think of that as, the patchification in one of your transformers. But unlike in a CNN, where neighboring neurons, or neurons at different positions in an image, can only communicate through feed-forward bottom-up connection, your visual system, and your cortex more broadly, is endowed with connections that enable neurons within a layer of the cortex to communicate. In a sense, this is not too far from what self-attention does in a transformer, except that this pattern of connectivity is highly localized. Now, the fact that this connectivity is localized does not imply that only neighbors can communicate, right? Because the brain is trading space for time. And if you have a local kernel of horizontal connection where a neighbor can speak to its neighbor, then the neighbor can also speak to the neighbor and the neighbor to the neighbor, etc. So in theory, in your visual cortex, neurons have the ability to communicate information that is about something at one corner of an image and communicate that information on the other hand of the image. In a convolutional neural network, you would have to wait for essentially the very tippy top of the convolutional neural network for these spatial dependencies to be learned. I'm not going to tell you very much about the computational neuroscience models. I'm just going to say that in general, or in the past, we used to use those kinds of differential equations which control the degree to which neurons pass information, and this kind of guide the activity of different populations of neurons, excitatory neurons, inhibitory neurons, etc. Back in the day, those kinds of dynamical systems guided by differential equations were literally impossible to train. We had to constrain pattern of excitatory inhibitory connections by hand based on electrophysiology data. Now with deep learning and all the goodies and all the deep learning toolbox, we can actually leverage the deep learning toolbox to train, that is, optimize the free parameters of this horizontal and more generally feedback connections, and optimize those for arbitrary visual recognition tasks, which is a major source of progress, I think, in our field. But before I show you actual results with some of those models, I wanted to mention the fact that one of the key assumptions we have in neuroscience is that those kinds of feedback mechanisms play a key role in the ability of the visual system to integrate the context in which visual information is presented. So I'm giving you here a few examples of so-called contextual illusions. And I'm taking a bit of a gamble here because those illusions are quite distance dependent. And so because I have no control over how far you sit from the screen, I have no idea who is going to be able to experience those illusions or not. Hopefully some of you will. On the right side there is an example of the so-called tilt illusion. This is the vertical grading presented in the context of a tilted surrounding gradings. Just the presence of this surrounding grading in the lab would yield a very significant shift in the perception of the orientation of the central grading. Depending on the angular difference between the center and the surround, this vertical grading is going to appear tilted left or right. This is an example in the orientation domain, but the same happens across all the visual domains. You have examples of these illusions in the motion domain, the disparity domain, and especially the color domain. I hope this one might work. I actually kind of see it here. The illusion on the far right is actually my favorite one. You see rings, concentric rings. Those rings are all made of somewhere around pink, lime, and purple. And you have to trust me on that. What it looks like a pink or salmon ring on the top is exactly the same RGB value as the orange ring at the bottom. In fact, the context, the surrounding rings are identical. The only difference is a swap between the lime and the purple. So you see that your perception of color is highly dependent in the context in which that color is being presented. Presumably, that very fact is a byproduct of the presence of these horizontal and feedback connections in your visual system. Now, I understand that I might not be doing a very good job here selling the need for feedback mechanisms to a computer vision audience by highlighting all the things that can go wrong because of those feedback connections. Because in a sense, when you think about this, you are seeing or experiencing this example where your own perception deviates from the ground truth. And so if your goal is to recover the ground truth, then you are experiencing hopefully not a bug, but what I hope is a features that correspond to an edge case, those very highly artificial stimuli for computational mechanisms that are otherwise optimal in our everyday natural vision. Okay, so to show you the benefits of those kinds of feedback mechanisms, I need to tell you about a challenge that we presented a few years ago called the Pathfinder. And so I hope you can see different images. So the top row correspond to, this is a binary classification task, the top row correspond to positive samples, the bottom row negative samples. I hope you can see contours. In fact, every column corresponds to different versions of the data set for which the contours are made of different lengths. On both the positive and the negative set, there are markers that are shown. Again, they are tiny, so I don't know if you can see them. On the positive set, the 2 markers for examples, and in fact here, just to make sure that everybody can learn, we give everyone 2 million training examples for a task that looks trivial, it's binary images. But our assumption is that if we have a recurrent neural network of the sort that I described earlier, with the ability to communicate through horizontal connections to neighbors, in theory, that neural network should be able to discover a visual strategy of what we would call incremental grouping or spreading of activation. It should be able to find and start from one of those markers, and then by spreading activity to the neighbors along the contour, it should be able to follow the contour, and then at the end, either the other marker is there, so there's a path going from point A to point B, or it's not, but the network should be able to answer the task or solve the task irrespective of the length of the contour, right? Because the same strategy applies whether you have a short contour or a long contour. In comparison, if you think about a feed-forward neural network, as I mentioned earlier, feed-forward neural network grow their receptive fields through depths. Our assumption here is that in order to solve the task, a feed-forward neural network will have to be able to build visual receptive fields that cover both the contour and the markers. And so our prediction was that for this task, as we train and test models on increasingly long version of the task, the minimal depths needed by a feed-forward neural network should grow. Okay. And we've shown just that. This is all published, and this plot is a little complicated, so I'm not going to go through all the details. I'll just point to the penultimate top cell, which corresponds to the performance of ResNets trained and tested on the 3 versions of the data sets for different control lengths, going from left to right. And I hope you can appreciate the fact that although a ResNet 18 and 50 can solve the shorter version of the contour of the pathfinder, you need to go all the way to 150 layers of depth, ResNet 151, for the feed-forward neural network to learn to solve the task. In comparison, if you look on the far left, if you look at the red dots, this is a single layer. So we instantiated our recurrent neural circuit with, at the time, a gated recurrent unit. We call it the HGRU, as in horizontal gated recurrent units. That single layer of a recurrent neural network can solve the task irrespective of the path length. And so when you replot everything on this lower left corner plot here, you find that yes, feed-forward neural network can, with 2 million training examples, they can also solve this otherwise trivial task, but it comes at the expense of a crazy increase in the parameterization of those models. Those models need 3 orders of magnitude more parameters than you need if you have just these horizontal connections. I'm not going to show you results here, but in practice, we have found over and over that when you train the same circuit on more naturalistic images, this parameter efficiency always turns into a greater sample efficiency, which means that those recurrent neural networks, because they are local, they can learn to do as well as equivalent feed-forward neural network with far fewer training examples. Now, the story becomes interesting when a few years later, a team at Google DeepMind integrated this challenge into one of their own evaluation benchmark, which I believe they call the long-range arena benchmark. And the goal of this benchmark was to evaluate semi-systematically the state-of-the-art in transformer architectures. And so they took, various kinds of tasks, some related to time series, some related to text classification, image classification, so on and so forth. And they added our pathfinder, which confusingly here is shown on this table. This is a table from their paper. This is under path X. And as I hope you can appreciate, again, this is not our work, this is a team at Google DeepMind, they were not able, despite the hundreds of thousands of training examples, they could not get a single transformer to learn that bloody simple task. In order for transformers to learn this task, they had to do a smart downsampling from 128 by 128, which is not a big image, down to 28 by 20, or 32 by 32. And then they were able to train, the transformers. But as you can see, the transformers are barely above, they are somewhere in the mid-60s, 70s. Again, remember that if I give you a single layer of our recurrent neural network, that network can solve the task perfectly at the full resolution and for any path length. Okay. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that the skeptical in the audience could be saying, well, there's nothing, your local pattern of connectivity can absolutely be learned by self-attention. And I have no doubt it can. But the point is that even on trivial tasks like this, the complexity because attention has to connect every location to every location. The complexity that arises from just forcing or having to learn long-range spatial dependencies yields to a critical bottleneck for those architectures. All right, the other good news for us, just connecting back to human data, is that we've done extensive comparison between the performance of our simple recurrent neural circuit with those of humans. I'm going to go very briefly, but just say that we have extended our Pathfinder task with the 2 markers and figuring out where those fall on the same contour or not, to a task involving contours of objects. There the task is both for models and human subjects. Are the 2 dots on the same object or not? And then when you evaluate humans on that task, there's a very interesting kind of results that suggests that humans are also leveraging a similar kind of incremental grouping strategy, which is that their reaction time is a function of the distance between the dots. The further the dots are, the longer it takes for people to decide whether those 2 dots are on the same surface or not. What is even more interesting is that the underlying distance metric, actually the actual distance is not metric distance, but it's a topological distance because there's an interaction between the distance between the dots and their distance to the object boundary. Surprisingly, the model we had trained on similar task predicts those human data almost perfectly. So I have 2 minutes left. I'm going to have to do the hard job of trying to convince the computer vision science skeptical in the audience. One could rightfully ask, if your neuroscience-inspired recurrent neural network models are so good, why haven't we heard about them? And I'm sure most of you haven't heard about them. And the short answer is that I'm sure many of you are familiar with training and scaling up RNNs is really hard, right? So in a sense here, we're training spatial depth computation for time, but that comes at the expense of a serial temporal dependency when we train our models. And so we've never been able to train the circuits until now at scale. The best we've been able to do is to take a pre-trained feed-forward model. So this is an example here with panoptic segmentation. The best we've been able to do was to take a state-of-the-art feed-forward neural network. At the time, these were the feature pyramid networks. And then slap in our recurrent neural module, and then just fine-tune the whole thing together. And when you do this, interesting thing happens. Here you see the strategy discovered now by the model, which is one of these kind of incremental grouping or filling in strategy, where the network seems to be starting its segmentation job somewhere in the center of mass of the object, and then spreading activity until it hits the border, the contour of the objects. But again, this is with the exception, and by the way, we were able to show that the addition of this feedback boosts the accuracy of the overall architecture beyond that of a purely feed-forward model. So this is a nice result, but as I said earlier, we were never really able to scale up to something like ImageNet's size or more. Now, the good news for us is that there has been a recent breakthrough in the development of the so-called state space model, or SSMs. Again, I'm not going to have time and to be able to do justice on all the great work that has been done. I'm just going to hand-wave my way around and just say that SSMs are or offer a way through linear recurrence to approximate for us potentially complex nonlinear dynamics using convolution and parallelizing, and so essentially removing this bottleneck of serial time dependencies. In general, we had to do a little bit of math to figure out how to use this SSM framework with our horizontal and feedback framework. But we found that if we actually do all the computation in the spectral domain, all the math works out, all the convolutions turns into multiplication, and we have stable trainable systems. This is why we call this module that I'm about to tell you the SCSSM, which stands for Spectral Convolutional SSM. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to flash these results. This is back to our Pathfinder, and I don't know, again, I know that the dots and the fonts are pretty small. I don't know how well you can see from a distance. This is back to our Pathfinder, and in general, for any of those plots, whether you look at transformers in red, they are very close to chance level, even the standard SSM that are just linearized, vectorized representations, they are the light kind of blues somewhere in the middle. And then as soon as we swap in our recurrent horizontal spectral convolutional SSM module, you get this new Pareto front here, which actually crosses human accuracy at about 90%. And every way you look at it, whether it's through computing efficiency, data efficiency, or parameter efficiency, that architecture beats all of the other approaches, including transformers and SSMs. We've been able to scale that up to ImageNet scale. This is just very kind of fresh out of the press. This is unpublished, but Drew Linsley, who is the SSM whisperer, has been able to essentially start from a single head VIT. We're still at the level of single head. Take out the self-attention from the single head VIT, swap in our SC SSM, and then what you can see here on this plot is that we are now able to train this whole architecture end-to-end with greater parameter efficiency than the SH VIT and very comparable accuracy. I don't want to make a big deal of these results because the real power of this approach is not in classifying images, but really dealing, because of this parallelization of temporal computations, we don't have the limitations that transformers have, and in theory here we can shove an arbitrary large number of frames and really process and learn temporal context over very, very extended time periods. Unfortunately, as I said, I'm out of time. So the initial results that Drew have that suggest that this approach works, he took a data sets for video generation, video phi2, and just slapped in our CSSM for as a way to fine-tune the architecture. And again, we find that we can do much better with less parameters than the state of the art. I'm going to leave the key takeaways out of my conclusion because I'm out of time. Instead, I'm just going to leave with the acknowledgements. I want to give a big shout out to Drew Linsley, who was a postdoc in my lab some 10 years ago. He has been a very close collaborator for the past 10 years, and he has been a leading effort in almost every project that I highlighted. I also want to give a shout out to a lot of the students that I stressed just a few days before this talk to make sure that we could show you the latest and greatest that was going on in our lab. So thank you so much for your time, and I'd be happy to take questions.
For a few questions, maybe. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Paul Mandel with Neurant. Excellent talk. One of the thoughts that I had was I understood why you didn't use the baby cameras for your research. It adds too many variables. But one of the things that I thought of is with your clicking, what is it called? Click Me.
Yeah.
You use a teacher, which is a human, and you use a student,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity for, sort of a really interesting, like, reinforcement learning style experiment where you have that baby with the camera essentially as a teacher, and for the lack of a better word, you sort of distill that knowledge into the student. I've talked with a lot of biologists. One of the things that they stress way more than computer scientists is the importance of evolutionary development, and then of course development as we grow up through life. And one of the things that I thought about when I was working on the OpenWorm was the initial thought with OpenWorm was if you could simulate C. elegans, you would understand its behavior, and they did all this amazing simulation work. It never happened. Now they're doing evolutionary development, but then there's this issue of, okay, how do you construct a reward function? So honestly, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, and so I'll just briefly
Sorry.
mention. So I think you alluded towards the end towards embodiment. I completely agree. In fact, a very active area of research in my group, and that I'm very excited about, is really moving beyond just passive data diets, being fed to our algorithms, to embodied systems that really have to learn to solve more ecologically valid tasks, just like navigating without bumping into things, grasping objects, which implicitly I think will encourage those models to learn to simulate, to learn to latch onto visual features that are not just important for image classification, but important for action, for grasping objects, for navigating, etc. And my guess is that that's going to yield to the, in my opinion, the biggest, greatest bang for the buck in leading models that are significantly better aligned with human vision than even what we can get through this kind of passive data diets that we've been developing.
All right, thank you. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Is it my turn? Hi, Thomas. Thanks for a
Very
great talk.
confusing. Oh, I see. You're alternating. Sorry.
My name is Yijia Chen. I'm a human vision scientist, so I'm on your side already. My question is actually about like the difference between the first part of your talk, where you're comparing with monkey physiological data, and later part where you're trying to match the human behavioral data. Do you find those models that match human behavior data also match monkey physiological data, or I'm sure you don't have those kind of cells like activation for those high-level tasks, but maybe RSA.
So we do have a paper published, actually part of the paper that I highlighted, one of the neural harmonization paper. We actually showed that one of the benefits of forcing the alignment, by injecting some of the psychophysics data, during training for those models, that does yield to a significant improvement in the ability of those models to fit monkey electrophysiology data. So, I think, potentially monkey electrophysiology and human behavioral decision data reflect, two sides of the same coin.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, so great talk. I just had like a quick question about the end. So you mentioned state space models, and I know you can parallelize in the sequences, you can do it in a single pass. I just had a question, and correct me if I'm wrong, regarding the feedback. Are you able to do that also in that same single pass, or is it like, how does that work?
Yes, everything gets parallelized at once. I won't be able to get into the details with my hands just at this very moment, but yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Your findings show that gains in model performance and task performance have decoupled from gains as models of biology. So my question is, what are your thoughts about, whether we should treat better brain alignment as optimization targets that we train toward, or as emergent properties that we should expect from the right architectures and learning mechanisms?
Yeah, a couple of points. I'll try to answer briefly, but no. So we should certainly not optimize. I don't think we should replace one benchmark, which is image classification or computer vision task, with another, which is neural alignment. I think this is counterproductive, and in fact, you'll never get enough neural data to properly constrain this architecture. I see myself primarily as a neuroscientist. My goal here really is to understand how the brain works, and so I think the exciting piece here is that AI, by allowing us to instantiate different principles, different theories of vision, allows us to test some of those ideas at scale, and then the degree to which the solutions discovered, the strategies discovered, align with biology or not, is just a marker of how successful or how close how correct this theory is. So I think this should be just taken as evidence for whether or not we are going in the right direction. Now, I want to make a broader point, which is, I'm not here to convince computer vision scientists to turn to neuroscience. I think it's possible, I don't know, but it's possible that with more scale, with transformers, the strategies that this neural network will discover, especially if we hit the right data diets, and when we go maybe for more embodiment, when we start aligning the goals of these agents towards more ecologically valid goals, I think it's entirely possible that some of the inductive biases that we know are baked into our brains could originate from the training of those models. I have no question about that.
本演讲实录已收录至雷锋网 CVPR 2026深度专区，现已全面上线。专区不仅全面收录了重磅论文的工程化解读、专家前沿演讲，更将持续更新前方记者的第一手会议动态。扫描下方二维码或进入雷锋网 CVPR 专区即可查看。